Bonjour. I'm Scott Simon, professor at the University of Ottawa, co-chair of the Taiwan Studies Research Chair, and senior fellow for Taiwan, human rights, and the Indo-Pacific at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I would like to begin by thanking the MLI for hosting this panel, Why Taiwan is a Natural Partner in Global Health Security. I thank our distinguished guests and all of those people who are watching all over the world. It is a great honor to begin this webinar by introducing Ambassador Winston Wu, who is now serving as the 10th representative from Taiwan to Canada as head of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Ottawa. He has served previously in Ottawa and Toronto, but in his 30-year career has also served as Director General of the Department of East Asian and Pacific Affairs and as Ambassador to the Republic of the Marshall Islands. So without further ado, I would like to hand over this platform to Ambassador Chen.
Thank you, Professor Scott Simon. Good morning to our distinguished participants and friends in Canada, and good evening to our friends and colleagues in Taiwan. My name is Winston Wu, Taiwan's representative in Canada. I'm pleased to see this panel come together. It is a combination of efforts, both domestic and international, toward a shared goal, the betterment of human health and well-being. This conversation will help frame why Taiwan is a natural partner and an important contributor to global health security, and then why Taiwan's exclusion from participation in the upcoming World Health Assembly is such a tremendous blow to not only global health, but the rule-based international order more broadly. As we have collectively learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, countries must work together in order to protect human health. In Taiwan, we have been fortunate to have found success in our efforts to control the virus. With fewer than 1,300 cases and then 12 days, we have demonstrated that there are techniques and approach to pandemic management, while we are effective and can be shared. This success has helped prompt significant international attention to the fact that Taiwan is unjustly excluded from the World Health Organization's function, including WHO meetings. Taiwan can help and then also leaving our support of the table is detrimental to global efforts in battling against the COVID-19 and a return to normal quickly. The fact is also why we are so tremendously grateful for the increasingly strong international support that we have received, especially the overwhelming support from Canada. Indeed, various levels of the Canadian government, particularly the Prime Minister himself, and then his cabinet, have been once again stated strong support for Taiwan's meaningful inclusion in international institutions like the WHO. Parliament have also been a strong and a vocal proponent of including Taiwan in multilateral fora. Indeed, all parties have expressed support and articulate clearly why Taiwan's inclusion is so central to global health. We thank the member of the Parliament and those in the policy process who have been prioritized, including Taiwan at the international table. Guiding such of this public policy debate has been media, opinion leaders, and of course, think tanks. We are particularly grateful to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for not only putting on today's seminar, but also for being the preeminent voice, arguing that Taiwan and Canada are natural partners. The result of these efforts are clear. For the first time ever, the G7 foreign ministers' communique expressed loud and clear support for Taiwan's WHO and WHA participation. Parliament and the legislature throughout the world are joining the chorus recently. The French Senate voted unanimously in clear support of Taiwan's involvement in the international community. In countries all over the world, the support is steadfast, bipartisan, and rapidly growing. Despite the WHO being once again dictated by single-state political objectives, we remain optimistic. That is because the outpouring of attention and support has put us at a crucial juncture. There are new possibilities and opportunities for Taiwan to participate on the world stage. This includes supporting the international community in terms of global health. But Taiwan also has much more to offer. We are a ready, willing, and like-minded partner in a wide range of areas, including trade and investment, climate change, sustainable development, transactional crime, civil aviation, and much more. During this event, I urge those listening to consider the full range of contributions that Taiwan can make as a partner. Additionally, we hope that this event will help further solidify this trend and help foster even closer ties between Taiwan and Canada. I'm confident that the best is yet to come. For the already substantial Taiwan-Canada relationship, and then today's event demonstrates that. And then with that, for your time and attention. And I will pass the floor back to our moderator. Professor Simon, over to you. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Ambassador Chen. This topic is very important to me personally, and because of all of the travel restrictions, a great source of concern. This is the first time since the 2003 SARS scare that I have not headed out to Taiwan immediately after the end of classes. Last year, I was doing research on Guam when the pandemic hit. After the first cases were detected on Guam on March 15th, 2020, I took the first flight back to Taiwan. And then because I had to go into quarantine and Air Canada canceled its ongoing flights to Canada, I ended up staying very comfortably in Taiwan until July 2nd. I was able to have a normal life, even eating in restaurants with friends and families, but I was watching the epidemic unfold elsewhere with great worry. So far, Taiwan seems to have been spared the worst. Taiwan was even able last month to hold their annual Mazu pilgrimage, this time with diplomats representing 13 countries, including Canada. An estimated 100,000 people were at the opening festivities that began the 9-day, 340-kilometer pilgrimage to temples around central Taiwan. That being said, this virus is very small and can get around, and it's quite dangerous. Taiwan's CDC in its daily announcement today reported that Taiwan has had a total so far of 1,290 cases and 12 deaths. That may sound miraculous compared to Canada, but the risk is not gone. Today, Taiwan had 34 new cases, including 29 cases of community infection with no international travel records. So people in Taiwan are concerned that a lockdown may happen. Actually, the whole world could have avoided lockdowns if the WHO had heeded Taiwan's warnings about the highly contagious nature of COVID in Wuhan in December of 2019. Taiwan's lack of status in the WHO was thus a crucial element that caused the current global health crisis. This anomaly of Taiwan not being a member of the WHO is caused by China's politically motivated boycott against Taiwan in international organizations. Taiwan, in fact, has been invited to WHA proceedings in the past. Suddenly, after the 2016 election of President Tsai Ing-wen, China has pressured the WHO to exclude Taiwan. 2021 is the 5th year in which Taiwan is excluded. This year, China's Taiwan Affairs Office of the State Council explained that they oppose Taiwan's participation because Tsai has not publicly accepted the political formula which they call the 1992 consensus of so-called OneChina, different interpretations. This means that China is putting their political goal of annexing Taiwan over the health and safety goals of the WHO. So in order to discuss this topic, I introduce our speakers. We have first Professor André Laliberté of the University of Ottawa. He's been a professor of political studies at the university since 2000. Since 1989, he has done research on various aspects of Taiwanese politics. He is now interested in how the Taiwanese government has obtained cooperation from religious actors in preventing super spreader events. The Honorable Tony Clement, former Minister of Health, is a former Conservative Member of Parliament for Parry Sound, Muskoka, and Ontario. Before entering federal politics, he served in the provincial government, including as Minister of Health and Long-Term Care. During his time in Parliament, he also served as Minister of Health, among other important positions. Jessica Drun, non-resident fellow at Project 2049, has held various positions at Washington, D.C. area think tanks, as well as in the defense contracting space. Her research interests include cross-strait relations, Taiwan domestic politics, U.S.-China relations, and U.S.-Taiwan relations. So we'll now move into a period of moderated questions, and I'll introduce very briefly the issue. And I think it's important to note that Taiwan's exclusion from the WHO and WHA has become an issue of international concern. We saw recently from the G7 Foreign and Development Ministers meeting that this came up. In their communique, in a section called China, they said, and I quote here, to strengthen global cooperation on issues of concern to all, we believe it is vital to ensure inclusive processes in international organizations. We support Taiwan's meaningful participation in World Health Organization forums and the World Health Assembly. The international community should be able to benefit from the experience of all partners, including Taiwan's successful contribution to the tackling of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this represents a consensus among G7 leaders. So I'd like to start out by asking a question to Honorable Mr. Clement. Canada has consistently supported Taiwan's meaningful participation in the WHO and WHA. Prime Minister Trudeau has also repeated his support several times. So what does meaningful participation mean in this context? What difficulties does Canada face in asking for meaningful participation?
Well, thank you for the question, Scott, and it's a great honor to be part of this event, and I want to commend the MLI for organizing it. Let me start to answer that by just telling a story. When I was Ontario Health Minister, the SARS outbreak happened in 2003. And at the time, we thought that was a cataclysm. Of course, it's been overtaken by horrific events with COVID since then. But Ontario was a focal point for SARS. So was Vietnam. So was Taiwan. And of course, the SARS emanated from the People's Republic of China. So what I found interesting out of that was, could we learn lessons from SARS and apply them to the next pandemic? That was my focus when I became federal health minister in 2006. Part of that was creating the first national pandemic plan for Canada. But also, I also watched what Taiwan was doing. And Taiwan did a very comprehensive lessons learned from the SARS outbreak. And they instituted those lessons learned as part of their framework. So when I became Federal Minister of Health, I thought it was incredibly important to have every member state or representation at the World Health Organization. You cannot have a worldwide pandemic plan if part of the world is not included. And so I helped lead the focus and the organization to getting Taiwan reconsidered as, at the very least, an observer member of the World Health Organization, and therefore would have the ability to attend the World Health Assembly, which is a once-in-a-year event of World Health Ministers. The more important thing is to be integrated into all aspects of pandemic planning in the World Health Organization. That push was successful in 2007, 2008. Taiwan was included, and then, as you heard from Scott, they were subsequently excluded in 2016 after the elections. So I think the same rule applies. Just as in 2007 and 8, we felt it important as a world community to have everyone who has a stake in pandemic planning listened to by the World Health Organization. That is even more the case after our experience with COVID. And certainly Taiwan's lessons learned approach from SARS in dealing with COVID has put it in the top of the world table when it comes to COVID response. Very few countries are there. Certainly Canada is not there. So that's my reasoning. And so in answer to your question, meaningful participation means that in the halls of decision making in the World Health Organization, Taiwan has to be there. It has to be looked at as a resource, as a source for best practices when it comes to pandemic planning and pandemic response, and of course part of the policy making process to better react to future pandemics. That to me is what meaningful participation is all about. And if we care about how the world together can respond better to the next pandemic, and believe you me, there will be one, then obviously having Taiwan at the table is very important.
Thank you for that. The G7 statement has been very supportive of Taiwan, and in a way it avoids directly challenging Beijing by including Taiwan in the China section of the communique, even though everybody knows that Taiwan has never been part of the People's Republic of China, not even for a single day in history. Still, China opposed the statement, even with this diplomatic compromise. What measures are needed to deal with Beijing's obstructionism? And I'll open that up to anybody who would like to speak. Monsieur La Liberté?
I really think that the international community should simply ignore this obstructionism. There's many ways in which, for example, for the WHO, I totally agree with Minister Clements that obviously Taiwan needs to be included. Its population is larger than half of the member of the United Nations, so it just does not make sense. There are many ways in which, for example, even in international meetings like the WHO, there could be parallel meetings organized where the experts, the representative of the health ministry in Taiwan are meeting their counterparts. So open meetings where everyone could join. Now, China would of course object, but because this would be informal, that could be certainly arranged, and therefore Taiwan would have its voice being heard. But the obstructionism is more deeply need to be resisted by the groundswell of public opinion. And so I think that the media in this country and also in other like-minded democracies must really put forward the effort of China to really silence Taiwan And what is remarkable is since the outbreak of COVID, there's a mounting realization in world public opinion that really Taiwan has been silenced by China. So I think that an increase in the consciousness of the obstructionism of China should be made more clearer, because even if the public opinion is aware, governments are still resisting because they are concerned about the response of China. But I think that democracies should start to fear more the opinions of the voters. So I think that it needs to be perhaps even considered an electoral issue in many democracies. I know that very often democracies are not decided by issues of international affairs, but in this case, really, international affairs are having direct consequences in our lives. I remember when I was teaching my course on comparative politics last year, just a few weeks before the outbreak of COVID, I started my class by saying that you might think that Asia is very far from us, but it might have developments that is going to affect us. I don't want to say I was a prophet, but still it resonates to me that at the time I remember watching every week, keeping an update to my class about the growth of the pandemic in China, and at the same time sharing with my class the fact that Taiwan has already closed the communication with China. And therefore, from the very beginning, it was clear that Taiwan was making the right decision. And at the same time that our government here was, I think, unconsciously deciding to maintain relations for fear of offending China. And therefore, we have this horrible situation that we're facing now. So in other words, I think it would be legitimate to say that we need to rethink our relations with Taiwan, and we should make it actually part of the electoral campaign.
Good, thank you. Would anybody else like to add to that?
I just wanted to say, I think that it's very meaningful, the G7 communique. We cannot stress enough that this is not usual for G7 communiques to have a specific reference to Taiwan, even in the China section. The fact that they felt the necessity to mention Taiwan by name and to have a specific prescription that was important for world health and the structure of the World Health Organization, it really is unprecedented. And we all know historically the red lines that the People's Republic of China and the CCP try to put in place with respect to Taiwan. And so this was a conscious decision by G7 nations to be respectful to the PRC, but at the same time make a point that respect did not preclude them from having an opinion with respect to Taiwan's meaningful participation.
I would just like to add that, it's definitely, it's already been said before in this conversation, but I think it's always worth stressing that Taiwan has participated as an observer before, and everything, that people are asking for right now, that countries like Canada and the United States and other like-minded countries, they're asking for something. They're not asking for something that doesn't already have a precedent. They're not asking for membership for Taiwan at the WHO, which hinges on sovereignty. They're just asking for Taiwan to have a seat at the table so that it can contribute to global health dialogue. And I think another point that's really worth stressing as well is that, as much as China tries to push the narrative that it has control over Taiwan and that Taiwan is a part of China, the objective reality right now is that China does not have administrative control or jurisdiction over Taiwan. So what's happening is you have a gaping hole in global health coordination because the government of 23 million people and a global travel hub do not have a seat at the table, cannot coordinate directly with the necessary agencies on how to prevent and manage the spread of a virus.
Yeah, those observations are very important. I think that they show the degree to what's happening is that in spite of the fact that Taiwan was participating in the WHA, China really is trying to blockade them and to prevent things from happening at the international level. So maybe we can take a more careful look at what Taiwan has done with COVID. And so perhaps somebody could say a few words about the lessons, really concrete, specific lessons that Canada can learn from Taiwan's best practices.
Actually, there were many lessons that we can derive from Taiwan's policy, public policies in tackling COVID. Actually, there are just too many. I cannot remember all of them from the top of my head. It was at some point, the Ministry of Health mentioned about 29 different lessons, but some are really, really key. And it's interesting to compare and contrast them to the policies that we have applied here. And one of the key ones was the high degree of tracing of contacts of people who were infected in a way that was difficult to implement in societies in which, people care so much about their individual liberties. But in Taiwan, the government managed to have these measures, very stringent measures of following people and their contacts. But the key issue here is that the population had trust in their governance competence. And I think that the leadership of the measures of mitigation against COVID, as soon as it appeared in Taiwan, was the fact that clearly the medical authorities were seen really as being in charge of the pandemic, of fighting the pandemic. So it was not seen as a political issue. It was seen as a public health issue in a way that is not always clearly understood in Canada and other democracies. Of course, our governments now is trying to valorize the importance of science, the importance of medical authorities. But I think that in Taiwan, one of the key features was that it was really put up front. But also, again, measures of discipline, of really collective discipline that were imposed on the population had really an important consequence. And I would add to that also the mobilization of the private sector, which is really, it's really striking that Canada before used to have a sector that would be able to produce PPE and all sorts of medical equipment that we have outsourced abroad. Well, in Taiwan, they also have had a lot of outsourcing, but quickly the government managed to mobilize different factories to produce masks to the point where Taiwan was able not only to help its population, but also to help other countries. So in other words, massive mobilization of the private sector by the government, reliance and trust on the medical authorities to really coordinate the response. And finally, a very, very clear implementation of measures of control, again, that were respectful of private liberties, but at the same time that came with some measure of constraint, but that people accepted as necessary for the welfare of all. So I think these are three very, very important lessons. And also, of course, the last one, I think that really is worth of considering. And that's a one that, again, our democracies have applied, but, in rather in a haphazard way at the beginning. But in Taiwan, from day one, this strategy of communication to the public that was by the health authorities, but also to instruct the population what measures need to be taken. And before I forgot, another issue too was the rationing of the mask at the very beginning of the outbreak. Measures that are difficult to imagine in this country. I still remember at the beginning, people were hoarding toilet paper. It's surreal to think about this kind of behavior. But at the very beginning of the pandemic in Taiwan, the authorities instructed all of the convenience store to set up a limit to the number of masks that people could buy. And there were methods to ensure that everyone would be entitled to a certain quantity of masks. And these early measures were made to respond to the fact that at the very beginning of the outbreak, there were limited quantities of masks. So after the government decided to mobilize the industry, then they could eliminate those measures that were a bit constraining.
Let me let me also add my thoughts on this. Andre has covered about 90% of it, but one of the things, again, lessons from SARS. Did we learn lessons? And Canada and Taiwan and Vietnam should have been the places that should have led the world. And guess what? Vietnam and Taiwan did. But anyway, not trying to be partisan, but that's just an observation. But let me say this. One of the things that we all learned from SARS is that the current regime in China, when faced with a public health emergency, buries that information for a period of time until it's no longer tenable and they have to fess up that something is going on. That's what happened with SARS, and lo and behold, that's what happened with COVID as well. But Taiwan had an early warning system. They were very attuned to the chatter going on in the People's Republic of China, WeChat or wherever, and they knew something was up in late 2019. They knew that something was happening, and they reacted very, very quickly. December 31st, 2019, all flights from Wuhan to Taiwan canceled. And we were still having a debate about that. Well, we're still having a debate about it. It's now May 2021. We're still debating about flights from afflicted regions. So they acted quickly. They acted resolutely, well before any other country did, to mitigate any damage from a pandemic. And so I think that's an important example. If you learn the right lessons from these situations, and don't expect, I'm sorry to say, it's a tragedy, but don't expect good behavior from the CCP and the People's Republic of China. They, when faced with a public health crisis, they're first, because you're in an authoritarian state and therefore authorities can do no wrong. That's according to the mythologizing of that happens in an authoritarian regime. They're burying bad information. But Taiwan was used to that, and they were sensitive to that, and they reacted quickly.
So, Jessica, would you like to add anything?
Sure. I think one thing that the COVID outbreak from late 2019 showed us was that a lot of the mechanisms that were set in place from the Ma era, that were set up between the WHO and authorities in China on how to relay information to Taiwan and how Taiwan can relay information back. And it's stovepiped, right? Because Taiwan has to channel information through China into the WHO, that those are largely ineffective. The CDC letter that Taiwan tried to send to the WHO through China about whether COVID seemed to be having human-to-human transmission, did follow these mechanisms, but they weren't heeded. And I think one of the big lessons learned that we take away from Taiwan from that time was that it understood that there's structural limitations in what it can do, and that, like was mentioned previously, that China was blocking access. And so Taiwan's lessons learned from SARS, which was also the case in Vietnam, was to start mobilizing a response before the international community had decided that it was a pandemic. We saw some countries, and I think Japan is one that comes to mind, that was waiting for directives from the WHO, and at that point it had already spread too widely to be effectively contained.
Good, thank you. When I was in Taiwan last year, I was really impressed at how every day at noon, the CDC would have a broadcast about what people should know about COVID, and people were watching it. And that was available through social media as well. I'm still following that. And when some cases came in from some sailors of the ROC Navy coming back from Palau, they actually, without naming the people, they just have numbers on them, told everybody where they'd been. And one of these people had been at the Mitsukoshi department store in Tainan on Thursday. And so everybody who was there on Thursday, and that included me, started taking care of their health by taking their temperature every day and watching very closely. And then actually 2 days after that person was at the department store, they disinfected the entire place. And so there are measures in place that are very good, and I think that's happening right now as well. So I think we can ask Mr. Clement, would it be possible for you to share some more of your experiences from your time as health minister? Why can't we have some better bilateral cooperation? Why can't we have a delegation coming from Taiwan to teach us how to deal with COVID? Why can't we send our health minister to Taiwan to learn best practices?
Well, I would encourage all of that. I think Canada can be on the side of the angels. No reasonable person would argue with the fact that all nations and territories, if you want to be specific, have to work together, both in the current pandemic situation and for future pandemics. And that requires state-to-state cooperation, not just, in my view, not just multilateral cooperation through the World Health Organization. I think we should have another MLI session on what's wrong with the WHO. That would fill 2 hours very quickly and easily. But I know that's not the topic here. But suffice to say that you shouldn't put all your eggs in the WHO basket, at least for the time being. Governance is really messed up over there. So that does require bilateral state-to-state. And as I've mentioned, Taiwan is important not only because of the best practices that Andre mentioned, but as I said, and I'm sorry if I'm stressing this too much, but early warning. One of the things we learned with COVID was that the early warning system that the Public Health Agency of Canada had set up was dismantled. And so Canada really doesn't have an early warning system of its own and does have to rely on other actors. And where should those actors be? Well, they have to be in East Asia. That's where a lot of this stuff emanates from. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So I think that that's in our national interest to have bilateral dialogue with Taiwan on health matters. I myself personally think that they should be broader than health matters. I think that there's some good economic ties that can be deepened, as well as cultural ties and historical ties. I know Taiwanese remember early missionary work by Canadians as an example. So we have a history in that part of the world that is well respected. So, what's the elephant in the room or the panda in the room? Of course, all of these things are reacted to by the CCP and the People's Republic of China. And so I understand the calibration, especially since we have 2 citizens still incarcerated illegally by the regime. So, I'm not being a Pollyanna about this. I know that there are consequences, but in answer to the question, yes, I think it is in our national interest to deepen those bilateral relationships.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to say a few words to that bilateral relationship between Canada and Taiwan? Yes.
So I think it's important, that we have to push back against, prevailing Chinese narratives. We saw what the Trump administration did by sending the Health and Human Services secretary I think late last year, I think is particularly instructive. We often get China saying that these moves violate the One China principle, but if you look at longstanding policy of the US, of Canada, and other like-minded countries, we don't abide by the One China policy, and we've never agreed to it. Each of our countries has its own One China policy that it sets the parameters for. So, at least for the US, it's in the past sent secretaries that don't hold portfolios that are super political or contentious, or that could be viewed as political or diplomatic, such as Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. The secretaries that hold portfolios that are more that contribute more to like the Health and Human Services one, to global health, to issues that are more apolitical and that benefit more communities have been sent, before to Taiwan. And if there needs to be a reassessment of, who should go, which portfolios are permissible, this is all within our own right and our own policies to make these determinations, and none of it falls on what we have agreed on with China. And I think this is an important point that the current administration is also pursuing, that everything that we're doing with Taiwan is pursuant to our One China policy and within our rights.
Andre?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what has been said so far. But I would just add that to deal with these issues in a bilateral framework is certainly important. But at the same time, I think that there's strength in numbers. And in Canada, we have been in the last 4 years a little bit inhibited by the fact of the Trump presidency, let's face it. But I think that now with the Biden administration taking a much clearer position with multilateralism, and also at the same time maintaining a more robust posture that is supportive of Taiwan, I think that Canada should not hesitate to really get on board and join the American administration, but also the Japanese. And we see similar development in the European community as well. So in other words, I think we are in a very important now set of circumstances in which multilateral cooperation would work much better. And I agree that it does not need to be necessarily at the political level, because we understand that might be confrontational, but certainly for issues like healthcare, this is vital. This is not unimportant. And this is not political. This is about health. It's about security, actually.
So I think that Ms. Dren made a very important comment there, that the United States is a sovereign, independent country, and so it can define its own One China policy. It can define its own relationships with Taiwan and its own priorities there. And I think that's certainly true about Canada as well. So I'd like to ask you to kind of give us a bit more details, because the U.S. has had a very independent policy towards Taiwan since the 1970s with the Taiwan Relations Act, with the 6 assurances. And then there's been a whole slew of new legislation coming in, not only during the Trump presidency, but also under the Biden presidency. And maybe those can provide some examples for Canada. So maybe you could summarize some of the most important things that have happened recently, and then the others can chime in and suggest what Canada can do to learn from that.
Sure. So I think, taking a step back from the legislation, I think the main points that have kind of come out with the previous administration that have continued into this administration is that, like I said before, that our One China policy is our own, and that we can operate under it and set the parameters for it as we see fit. This has come up with the overturning of the contact guidelines. I'm not sure what Canada's approach to this is, but the US recently lifted how at what levels it can engage with official representatives from Taiwan and allow access to US government facilities such as the State Department for representatives from Taiwan. There have also been calls in legislation to help Taiwan enhance Taiwan's opportunities in international forums such as the WHO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and a slew of other legislation that I think some of it's still in the bill stage, so I'm not sure how much is going to change before it gets passed.
Good, thank you.
Let me just add my 2 cents worth, if I could. I think one of the things that Canadian policymakers have to understand is how things have evolved in the last 10 years. This is not a static situation. It was 20 years ago and 15 years ago where we were still welcoming the People's Republic of China into international institutions as a way to guide the graceful rise of a future world power. That was the strategy. Get them into the World Trade Organization, have these engagements through trade policy with the EU and with North America and so on and so forth. Then as China's rise created all of these ancillary issues in the South China Sea and the early stages of the strangulation of Hong Kong and so on, then it became competitive engagement. That was the moniker. Yeah, we have to compete in some areas, but we have to also cooperate. Climate was always an issue. Climate change was always an issue where there has to be world cooperation, regardless of what China is doing in many different other areas. I think we've entered a third stage where the bloom is off the rose. The intentions are much more exposed when it comes to the leadership. I'm not talking about the Chinese people at all, but the leadership within China with the perpetual dictator Xi Jinping. So I think the world and the U.S. policy it's a bipartisan consensus in the U.S. The one thing that Trump and Biden agreed upon was we had to get tougher. They had to get tougher on China. I think we're beyond competitive engagement to recognizing there are threats. Clearly, the world wants to engage with China with things that are mutually beneficial, such as climate, but there are a number of threats even in that supply chain. If you want to have clean tech, do we all have to go to Beijing on bended knee to get our critical mineral supplies, for instance, to get our semiconductor chips, to get the electric batteries that are going to power electric cars? Is that a good strategy? I think the consensus now is no. We need a separate supply chain in order for our national security, but also to meet our climate goals. So for Canada's policy on China to remain static in that kind of sea change in attitude, which we saw from again, I refer to the G7 communique, doesn't make any sense. Now, I'm not saying, I think it's pretty clear that Justin Trudeau started out in 2015 with a certain perspective on China. Certainly the government has, I think, woken up to the fact that that is not in Canada's interest anymore. So I'm not laying this at the feet of Justin Trudeau. Took a little while to get there, but I think we're in a different spot right now. But all I'm calling for is that we continue to talk to our allies, the US, G7, EU, and better coordinate a strategy, which in turn animates our interactions with the Republic of China in Taiwan.
Okay, I just, well, thank you, because you said most of the things I wanted to say, but I wanted to add one additional factor. Actually, I think that we are too cautious because the One China policy is premised on a very, very important condition, which is that eventual unification in China or whatever evolution of relations between China and Taiwan is premised on peaceful interaction. And we are entering, as you suggested, a third stage in which this peaceful nature of relations between them is being compromised by one side only. And I think that it's important to consider whether we want to rethink our support to the One China policy. It's been said, I understand that for politicians, it's very difficult to say such a thing, but I'm not a politician.
Thank you, Andre, for saying what's needed to be said for quite a while. I think that there has been a new twist this year. And it seems that in an email response to Taiwan's central news agency about the WHA issue, WHO spokeswoman Margaret Harris said that the decision about whether or not to include Taiwan in the WHA should be made by means of a vote by the WHO's 194 member states. You know, that even opens up the possibility of membership to the WHO if the envelope were to be pushed a bit. But what kind of strategies would be needed to secure the support of 50% plus one of member states? That's a big hurdle?
I was doing the math when you prepared the question, and thinking about all the countries in the EU, the Organization of the American State, and even ASEAN, because you could understand that they are a little bit nervous about their relations with China because of recent events in the South China Sea. But we're still left with, if we include the allies, the diplomatic allies that Taiwan can count on, we're still short of about 25 states that would need to join. So that's going to be an extremely difficult hurdle to surmount. So I don't know what kind of strategy that perhaps Canada and other G7 nations can perhaps try to persuade countries in other parts of the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, in the former Soviet Union space. But of course, there's all the BRI scheme that is going to be a very, very important, counterbalance to any effort in that direction. And of course, that kind of strategy would be very, very difficult to implement simply because it will raise alarm in Beijing. So I think it will have to be perhaps through different channels.
I agree with Andre. I've been to the annual Jamboree, which is the World Health Assembly, I guess about 5 times. It's always in Geneva. It has a feel of a UN General Assembly. A lot of the activity is already baked in before you even get there. It's a chance to get some bilateral meetings and so on, but it's not a true forum for that kind of debate. Yeah, Canada would have to obviously have a lot of diplomatic alliances working for the same goals. So this would have to be as Andre mentioned, a North American plus and South American plus European plus some countries in Asia push. Again, you're not pushing for diplomatic relations with Taiwan. You're pushing for meaningful participation in the only place that exists for that when it comes to world health, global health issues. So I think that is, I think, how you would try to overcome that hurdle. But it's not going to be easy. And as Andre signaled, we all know that the Chinese leadership in Beijing is not going to lay down quietly while this is going on. They'll know about it. They'll spy about it. They'll be surveilling, just as they're probably surveilling this conversation right now. And so that's what you're up against.
I agree with my co-panelists that the threshold is very high. I also want to point out that there's a narrative control element here by putting the vote on the floor. I think China is trying to play up its narrative that Taiwan is a troublemaker, because by putting it on the floor, you're taking time away from touching on other issues of global health. I know it's not the United States' preferred way to talk about Taiwan observership. And China's very good at telling other countries, especially smaller states, look, this troublemaker Taiwan is pressing so hard that it's politicizing the WHO, whereas it should be viewed that the WHO has already been politicized because China is unwilling to let Taiwan come to the table. That said, I have been impressed with the initiative that has come out of the U.S. House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee. They've put forth, I think, earlier this month, the hashtag campaign on Twitter, hashtag Let Taiwan Help. And we've seen that gain so much momentum on that platform. We've seen representatives and senators in the U.S. And counterparts in Canada from parties across the board, even from other countries in Latin America. And you're seeing bipartisan, or I guess multi-partisan support for Taiwan in countries across the world from parliamentarians generally. And this is an initiative that is new, because I think in the past, efforts to call for Taiwan's participation from governments have been at the executive level. And so I think there's an element here where you have parliamentarian consensus that can provide pressure against their executive governments to get Taiwan a seat at the table. So I don't know if the threshold's there, but I think there is a lot more momentum this year because of this new approach.
Good, thank you. I think that the pandemic certainly shows that for global health, we need to have every jurisdiction involved. And this also applies to other issues such as avian safety, the issue of transnational crime. So if we think at a broader level, what place can we imagine for Taiwan at other organizations such as ICAO, Civil Aviation, Interpol, maybe even new organizations like the CPTPP? And how can Canada help Taiwan get a place in those other institutions?
Okay, I just wanted to reply quickly to the question that was in the chat because I think it's important. Someone was suggesting that maybe we should consider withholding funding to the WHO. And I think this is not the way to go, simply. I think it's important to clarify that because when there were attempts to do that in the past, that goes really, really bad. And actually, this is not working in our favor. So to get to your question now, I think that a perfect example of an international organization that really we should invite Taiwan to join is the CPTPP. Because that's an economic agreement. That's an economic agreement that does not have the same kind of criteria for inclusion, but at the same time that is really significant and that allows for important activities to happen. So I think that to think of international organizations that have a slightly more inclusive criteria for inclusion definitely should include Taiwan, and therefore the multiplication of such international organizations that have Taiwan as a member would gradually create a fait accompli of Taiwan's greater presence in international organizations. And I think that this could be certainly a multilateral effort. And so the CPTPP countries definitely would not object to that. Most of them would be quite supportive of Taiwan's inclusion. And I think we should focus on that kind of organizations.
Do we have other suggestions for how Canada can help Taiwan get into other organizations?
Well, let me just say, this is why the communist Chinese leadership would be lighting their hair on fire over the World Health Assembly, because the same sort of argument, there's no logical red line. Once you say that for health and safety of the world, Taiwan should be welcome in the World Health Organization, well, why isn't that the case when it comes to international transit and transportation? Why isn't that the case for economic cooperation that makes the world a healthier, safer place? Why isn't it the case when it comes to cooperating on, to stamp out international criminal activity? There's no line that separates World Health Organization from all of these other activities. So much as I disagree with the official stance of the People's Republic of China, there is an internal logic there that makes this question problematic, because there will be a severe reaction to that, at least by the current leadership. I mean, one aspires that when and if Xi Jinping is retired, that maybe a future Chinese leader, even within the CCP, will have a different perspective on these kinds of issues. But it certainly is not the case with the current leadership, which makes it difficult to expect to see that happening without a fight.
On what we can do to get Taiwan to participate within these organizations. I think it's worth flagging that there are critical elections coming up for leadership roles in a number of these organizations. For example, I think of the WHO Director General Tedros is up for re-election in 2022. And I believe one avenue, and correct me if I'm wrong, for Taiwan's participation is through an invitation from a Director General. It's unclear to me if this requires coordination with the PRC and to what extent it is, if so, and if this varies by UN specialized agency. But I think that is one possibility on the table, is that if if like-minded countries like the US and Canada put their backing behind a candidate that is more supportive of having broader representation, such as Taiwan, at the table, this could be one potential avenue. That said, it's also worth taking a step back and focusing on kind of how we got here, on broader concerns on how a number of UN organizations no longer fully operate as they were originally intended, which is to serve the global community rather than, a specific country's interests. So I think one thing that can be done is to place emphasis on the principles that these organizations were founded on, through coordination between, the United States, Canada, other democracies, and play a greater leadership role by being more active within these organizations so that we can serve as a counterweight to Chinese influence.
Well, I heard what Jessica says, and I totally agree. And when you were talking, I was having in mind the Human Rights Commission, which is a perfect example. Many countries that don't respect human rights are part of this committee, which is defeating the purpose of why it was set up in the first place.
Good. Thank you, everybody. I think we'll now move into the questions from the audience, and they're beginning to come in. So I have an audience question here. If vaccination is one of the best practices for combating COVID-19, why is Taiwan encountering so many problems in acquiring the necessary vaccines for its citizens?
I'm not aware of the reason why this is the case, so my response can only be tentative. But the fact that Taiwan does not have official relations with so many other governments probably is an impediment to the regular exchange between the health authorities in different countries that could perhaps facilitate the delivery of vaccines. But I'm not aware that Taiwan has difficulties in acquiring the vaccine, because it's not been in the news very much, because Taiwan being basically able to contain the pandemic, the issue of vaccination has not emerged to the fore as a major issue. So I'm as surprised as many of you may be to learn that it has problem to acquire vaccines.
Yeah, I think the audience questioner, I do know him as a former member of Parliament. So good to have CS on the call. So I wasn't aware of that as well either, rather. But vaccine supply chain, as we've seen, is also the subject of vaccine diplomacy. And so it is not only vaccines are not only a shield to protect your own population, but it has also become a form of advancing your national goals if you happen to be a net exporter of vaccine. So, and where, I don't know what's going on in the US administration when it comes to making those decisions, but they are very clearly looking at Africa and Asian countries as a place where the Chinese with their vaccine are seeking to leverage influence through their vaccine exports. So it may well be that that at least in the American situation, they're at the first instance seeking to counteract that and to get any surplus vaccines to places where it'll counter the Chinese leverage that is going on right now.
Jessica, did you want to add anything to that?
I want to jump off the point and
Okay.
point out that, you know, for a lot, China is targeting a lot of Taiwan's diplomatic allies with vaccines in an attempt to get these countries to change its diplomatic recognition from the ROC to the PRC. I think the most striking example that comes to mind is Honduras, where China is trying to sell Sinovac, and Honduras has reached out to Taiwan. I think I'm less clear on the logistics and how the coordination for vaccine coordination works, but I read an article about how Honduras had reached out to Taiwan, so looping through the United States to acquire dosages of AZ. But I think there was a delay there. And then if you hone in on the more domestic levels in Honduras, there seems to be a campaign by, I think, the Honduran Chinese Business Council to try to bring in Sinovac vaccines to the more local level. So you're seeing attempts to undercut the national level. And then, you know, what that means in terms of how local populations perceive Taiwan versus China, and how that could play out by pressuring, you know, the Honduran government by essentially sending the message that the PRC is more concerned about their well-being than the diplomatic ally of Taiwan. So I think, at least for the US and for other like-minded countries, if there's a way to help coordinate supplies of vaccines to Taiwan diplomatic allies, there's definitely a campaign by China to try to get them to switch diplomatic relations based on global health issues.
Yeah, that's a big issue. I understand in Taiwan that it's possible to get the vaccines by paying a very small fee. The question is convincing people to do it because there haven't been COVID cases around them. And so I'm a bit concerned because I've seen some things online that my father-in-law has been passing around about how you can prevent yourself from getting COVID by things like taking hot showers and eating bananas, and also about side effects of COVID. So I'm a bit concerned about some of the fake news that's becoming an issue there in Taiwan. But back to the audience questions. Somebody brought up Audrey Tang, and that actually segues right into what I just said about dealing with fake news. So what role does digital governments play in combat COVID-19 and getting people vaccinated?
Well, that was a key factor that explained the early success of the Taiwan actions to mitigate the pandemic. Audrey Tang developed software that ensured that there would be an immediate identification of convenience stores where you can buy masks, for example. She also developed an app that would allow people to contact and trace people who were contaminated. So there were many measures like that she undertook that really made a difference in the early attempts to tackle the pandemic. And of course, that was all part of the broader strategy of the communication between the government, and that really enforced trust. But as you said, it's an ongoing struggle because of the presence of fake news.
Yeah, I can just add that from Andre's and Scott's descriptions, it's very clear that there's at least I'm not there, but it seems that there's a high level of social solidarity in Taiwan, which is not necessarily the case in Canada or the US. So it makes it easier to do track and trace, to use, you know, it's intrusive to have something to have an app on your phone that is tracing your movements, although it's happening all the time already. But when government gets involved, it's a different ballgame, and so people quite rightly get a little bit skeptical. I wouldn't say quite rightly. It's a natural human emotion. Let's put it that way, to be a bit skeptical with the suggestions for surveillance at least in our society. So that's been an additional hurdle here that may not be the case there. And it's just things like masking up. Masking up there is just a lot more common. There's no cultural feedback against that. I remember during SARS, my chief public health officer in Ontario he would really react if somebody was wearing a mask outdoors. He thought that was the stupidest idea ever, even in 2003, this was a cultural phenomenon in East Asian communities in Toronto, let's say. But he thought it was overkill. He thought it sent the wrong message. It would create stigma. Now I think we're in a different world, obviously, and that is not where people are at. But that wouldn't even be a topic of discussion in many of these East Asian countries, because the cultural significance of masking up, there's no downside to that. It's what you do if you're sick. So I think that's part of why these things can operate better there than here.
I want to add that a lot of the initiatives spearheaded by Audrey Tong have helped with transparency and accountability of the government, because a lot of the programs have been run by citizens groups and community groups. So there is that added layer of holding the government accountable, of ensuring transparency and making sure that the data is used responsibly. So by upholding cohesion, this social cohesion in Taiwan, and by making sure that the government is held accountable, I think that has helped a lot in terms of the effectiveness of Taiwan's COVID response, especially through its digital governance system.
Well, thank you again. That's an important point that I failed to mention. You're absolutely right. It's not only a top-down success, it's also a matter of civil society in Taiwan being very, very vibrant and cooperative. Absolutely.
Yeah, if we're looking at vibrant civil society and we're looking at trust in the government and transparency, I think that all shows the importance of democracy and how democracy is more than elections. I think that I'll bring in another question from the audience here, and talking about spread of other kinds of governance. But China has their Belt and Road Initiative. And so how does this BRI interact with global health issues? Does it compel states to comply with Beijing's broader geostrategic goals, including undermining international institutions? How can other countries, and I think it's Western countries, but also Japan and other like-minded countries like India, how can they overcome this pressure to exclude Taiwan and endanger human health? And so what are the important partners there?
Yeah, a very, very important question from the audience on that. And I think what you see is it's very interesting, because the official Beijing position is you really shouldn't tie things together. Let's deal with this issue over here and that issue over there. If you're tying issues together, that's you're imposing solutions. It's not very polite of you. That's been Beijing for decades, right? And of course, what does Beijing do? They tie everything together. Always have, always will. And BRI is a great case in point, where dollars to donuts. They're saying, well, if you want our $10 billion investment in your port, then you got to toe the line on these issues. That conversation happens all the time. Now, the good news, I think, from the point of view of the Index of World Freedom, is that is very heavy-handed by Beijing. It's creating more enemies than friends, even if you have a lot of money. That doesn't necessarily buy you goodwill. And then when you construct things that fall apart in 10 years, then there's that aspect of it as well. So I think I've always been a predictor that the leadership in Beijing is going to overreach. They're going to spend a lot of money without a lot to show for it. But in the meantime, you're going to have this very aggressive stance by Beijing that is going to require the West, in the broadest term, to react and to be proactive as well. And I think you're starting to see that. It's very clear to me that this is happening in many fronts, whether it is tech, with Huawei, or with semiconductors, with the critical mineral supply chain. It's happening. So I don't think ultimately you should, or one should automatically assume that China will be successful with this strategy.
Yeah, I agree with what Minister Clement has just said. I think that BRI is really a case of overreach. It happened just too quickly. It was not it's a contrast to, we used to think of China having a vision in the long term, but what is striking is that the BRI happened so quickly. And I think it was not as well thought out as it claims to be. And the fact of the pushback coming from places as diverse as Pakistan, Burma, but also in Eastern Europe suggests that it's not as invisible an international organization as it seems. Well, it's not international organization, but attempt to have international influence.
That all said, I think it's still worthwhile for the US and Canada and its partners and allies to provide an alternative investment model for these countries, just because if they need investment and there's nothing else on the table but China's, they'll probably still seek it out. So for the US, Canada, and its allies and partners to remain engaged in an international community as much as possible.
Oh, I completely agree with you. I didn't want my comments to suggest otherwise. And again, we're starting to see those kinds of discussions at high levels with the Biden administration, which are doing a complete, as you know, top to bottom review of China policy. And I guess that's still a few months away, but you're already seeing the pivot going on various issues. So I expect to see a lot of cooperation on that front in the future.
So we have another question from the audience here. It says, what's the next step for Canada? Should we prepare for the next WHA meeting? And in the meantime, should we look to sign a foreign investment protection agreement with Taiwan, or look to CPTPP ascension? I think there are a lot of other things out there too, like how to include Taiwan into an Indo-Pacific strategy. But I think that those questions really are a nice segue to ask some concluding questions. So maybe we can go to each one of you, keeping all of those in mind. If you can make a few positive recommendations or come up with some principles for the federal government to use as it grapples with all of these issues going forward. And so I think it makes sense to start with Honorable Clement.
Okay, so a couple things. First of all, having been in cabinet and in having these discussions, I would be very shocked if there weren't cabinet level discussions on, obviously how to deal with any threats coming from Beijing, how to advance Canada's diplomatic interests, how to save those poor two gentlemen who are still incarcerated. All of this is cabinet level stuff. So the next step should be develop a comprehensive diplomatic and political and economic plan. I think part of it has to be supply chain and ways to include Taiwan in our supply chain and to, quite frankly, decouple in areas where our national security and public health and economic future dictate that we decouple from the preeminent supply chain in the world right now, which is all belts and roads lead to China. So in that sense, I think those discussions should be happening, and they should be happening not only in Canada, but also in conjunction with the Biden administration and with other allies like Japan and Korea and so on. So that's point one. Point two, specifically on the World Health Assembly, and the World Health Organization more generally, there has to be some leadership from the Public Health Agency. So that means Dr. Tam, as well as Minister Haidu, all the way up to Prime Minister Trudeau, to land in a place where we should land. It's one thing to utter support. It's another thing to manifest that on the world stage. And I think we're at that point right now where words are not enough, that we have to be diplomatically, at the very least, diplomatically active in these areas. So that's what I expect to see from the Trudeau government if they're taking this seriously.
Okay, Professor Laliberté?
Well, I totally agree again about those points that were mentioned, but I would simply like to add that it's important that there's public awareness on these issues that is becoming more important and more visible to keep the pressure on our governments. So I think this is really important to, and I by the way, I take this opportunity to congratulate the MLI to organize that kind of session, but I hope also that other think tanks in this country will also do likewise. And I'm also pleased that I've noticed that in the last few years, the Canadian media has shifted, and I think this is important to maintain this change of consciousness. But to address the second issue, I say yes to all of those different proposals that were put on the table, that definitely Canada should invite Taiwan for foreign investment protection agreement, and should also invite Taiwan to join the CPTPP. And as I said before, other organizations of that nature. It's absolutely important.
Ms. Drun?
So my co-panelists were very comprehensive. So I would just like to add that while Canada and the US should continue advocating for Taiwan to have a seat at the table at a number of UN specialized agencies, one thing that it can do in the interim is to either begin, advance, or continue information sharing channels. I know the US oftentimes will channel information that it receives from ICAO to Taiwan. And I think, that's an avenue that can be pursued while China is blocking Taiwan's access in order to fill the gaps, fill the knowledge gaps, fill the technical gaps, so that Taiwan is not behind and caught by surprise by any changes in standards and to any developments in the global community.
I think that we've been talking so far about what the government can do. And so maybe in conclusion, we can think more broadly. And I think many of our listeners today will be thinking about what they can do. So what do you think the Canadian and other democratic civil societies can do to help Taiwan? What role maybe do universities play and other civil society actors? What can ordinary people do to help Taiwan, which will make the world a safer place for everyone?
Well, when you say the civil society, I don't think that, academics are not exactly like the ordinary people. And I don't think we are extraordinary people too, but we certainly have a role to play in our interactions with people in government, but also with the future generations, to be really aware of Taiwan's situation. We do have, I would say, a liberté de parole. It's not freedom of speech, it's beyond that. We are not, as academics, bounded by the kind of strictures that politicians must respect. And I totally, by the way, sympathize with the caution that politicians would express, because I understand that they have to deal with many, many different constraints that we as academics don't have to deal with. So I think it's important from our part to really sensitize the population to the ethical dimension of the gross unfairness that Taiwan is experiencing. And I think that this kind of consciousness is having an impact down the road to the people, and there are some people in the MLI that are representative of that trend. So people who are aware of the injustice of the Taiwan exclusion from the international community, people who are going to be influential not only in academia and government, but people who will be involved also in the private sector, in NGOs, and people who will have the ability to resist the kind of worldview that China is trying to impose. Just a few decades ago, the idea that the One-China policy was seen by many people as something real. And now today, most people see through. This is a charade, and that's not a representation of the reality. I would just add finally that I think that the media does play a crucial role. And again, I really want to celebrate here that in Canada, we have seen in the last few years an important shift in the journalism for our national media. On both cases, I can talk about a kind of bipartisan agreement that Taiwan matters, and that the exclusion again of Taiwan by China is seen for what it is. It's an act of international bullying. I just hope that the op-ed pages of our newspapers will also be more welcoming to people who challenge the dominant discourse.
Let me perhaps go next and just add one other facet to this, which we haven't really touched on to any great degree. Time, of course, is our enemy because there's so much to discuss here. But I'm fascinated by, in terms of the shift of public opinion, with the interrelationship of Taiwan to the crushing of Hong Kong, to the Uyghur genocide. All of these things together are like a perfect, and of course the cover up with COVID. These are people saying China is authoritarian, but it's well governed. I kind of beg to differ on that. They're not governing well. And people are suffering as a result. So Taiwan is part of a larger story of this authoritarian regime, which is hurting many people within its own borders, and is threatening its neighbors, including Taiwan. So let's not forget that this is part of a larger story that will shift public opinion. And there are voices out there that are and they're no friends of mine, but they're progressive voices who probably disagree with me on a bunch of stuff. But we should agree on the Uyghur genocide. We should agree on the crushing of democracy in Hong Kong. We should agree that it's not right or fair to bully Taiwan. And that's where I hope public opinion in Canada is going.
I want to add that on the civil society front, I think there is a lot more room for engagement and for channels of communication that can oftentimes fill the void that the international community kind of leaves open for Taiwan in terms of sharing best practices, technical know-how, and also in elevating Taiwanese and expertise. Taiwan and Taiwanese expertise on the world stage to show that Taiwan can contribute, even if it's not in formal channels. It still showcases that Taiwan is a responsible stakeholder in the international community and that there's much that they can do. That said, I think we should also find ways to encourage more people-to-people interaction, be it through studying in Taiwan, travel to Taiwan, research in Taiwan, because that opens up more doors for better understanding of Taiwan and Taiwan's story. I think oftentimes when we look at Taiwan, a lot of things are painted pretty black and white. It's either pro-unification or pro-independence, but there's so much nuance lost there. And I think as more people understand these details, it helps foster better understanding of Taiwan's place in the world and what we can and cannot do in regards to Taiwan.
So I want to thank everybody. We are definitely running out of time, and there's certainly a lot to say. I think that you've all made it very clear that Canada can play a role in this, and you've also made it clear that it's not just Taiwan. Taiwan is an obvious part of the China threat to the world, but China also has threatened parts of Japan, part of India, and I think the people who suffer most from the Chinese Communist Party control are Chinese people, and Taiwan offers an example that Chinese people can be free and democratic, and so we should let the world and China know about the good things happening in Taiwan. And so, yes, Taiwan can help. So let's do our best to help Taiwan. And I thank the MLI for this. And it's now time to end. So thank you, everybody, for your contributions and for listening today. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.